Imagine a winter night in the Carpathian Mountains, where the boundary between the living and the dead is as thin as the membrane of a frozen breath. The wind carries something more than cold through these ancient passes. It carries memory. It carries warning. It carries the weight of a darkness that has walked these valleys for centuries, long before the name Dracula ever graced a printed page. This is where the true vampire was born. Not in the elegant drawing rooms of Victorian fiction, but in the shadowed villages of Romania, where the dead did not always stay buried, and the night belonged to something far more terrible than literature could ever capture. Welcome to the realm of the Strigoi, the original vampires. The undead that inspired 1,000 imitations but have never been equaled in their primal, visceral horror. These are not the charming aristocrats of modern cinema. They are not tragic anti-heroes cursed with immortality and perfect cheekbones. The Strigoi are something far older, far stranger, and infinitely more disturbing. They are the reanimated corpses that claw their way from Romanian graves, bloated with stolen blood, driven by an insatiable hunger that transcends mere sustenance. They are the living witches who drain life force while their victims sleep. They are shapeshifters, energy vampires, and the personification of death's refusal to accept its own finality. Before we journey deeper into this shadowed world, I invite you to join our community here at Echoes of the Old World. We explore the authentic folklore that shaped human fear across cultures and centuries, the myths that were never meant to entertain, but to warn. Subscribe now, because what you are about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand the vampire legend. This is not fantasy. This is the raw, unfiltered horror that kept entire villages awake at night, that drove communities to exhume their own dead, that created rituals of protection so specific and desperate they could only have been born from genuine terror. And before we continue, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. Are you in the Carpathian region itself, where these legends still whisper through mountain passes? Are you halfway across the globe, encountering the Strigoi for the first time? Your perspective matters, because folklore lives and breathes through the people who carry it forward. Let me know where you stand as we prepare to cross this threshold together. The Carpathian Mountains stretch across Central and Eastern Europe like the spine of some vast sleeping creature. Romania sits at their heart, a land where Orthodox Christianity merged with pre-Christian beliefs, where Roman occupation left its mark on language and custom, where isolation preserved traditions that the modern world has long forgotten. In these remote villages, the relationship between the living and the dead was never simply a matter of mourning and moving forward. It was a constant negotiation, a careful observance of rules designed to keep the departed in their graves and the living safe in their beds. The veil between worlds was not a metaphor here. It was a practical reality that demanded respect, vigilance, and sometimes terrible action. The word Strigoi comes from the Romanian striga, meaning to scream or to cry out. Some scholars trace it further back to the Latin strix, a term for a screech owl or a blood-drinking night demon that plagued ancient Rome. The connection is telling. From the very beginning, the Strigoi were creatures of the night, associated with piercing cries that shattered sleep, with predation, with the violation of natural boundaries. They were never meant to be romantic figures. They were abominations, mistakes in the natural order, consequences of improper burial, unfinished business, or a life lived in defiance of sacred law. Understand this clearly from the outset. The Strigoi mythology is not a single unified legend. It is a complex system of belief that varies from region to region, village to village, family to family. What remains consistent is the fundamental division between two types of strigoi. The strigoi, viu, the living witch, and the strigoi, mort, the risen dead. Both drain life. Both exist in violation of natural law. Both represent the terrifying possibility that death is not an ending, but a transformation into something hostile, something hungry, something that remembers the faces of those it once loved and now seeks to consume them. The landscape itself seems to understand this darkness. Travel through rural Romania even today, and you will find crossroads marked with wooden crosses, windows rubbed with garlic, iron horseshoes nailed above doorways. These are not quaint decorations, they are active defenses. Remnants of a world view where the night was genuinely dangerous, where stepping outside after dark without protection was an act of profound recklessness, where the scratching at your window might not be wind or branch, but something that knows your name and wants inside. This is where we begin our journey. At the edge of understanding. At the threshold where folklore becomes something more visceral and immediate than mere storytelling. The Strigoi are waiting in the chapters ahead, not as entertainment, but as a mirror reflecting humanity's oldest fears about death, decay, and the terrible possibility that the grave is not the end, but merely a doorway to a different kind of existence. An existence defined by hunger, by corruption, and by an eternal separation from the peace that death should bring. Join us as we pull back the veil. The night is deep, the boundaries are thin, and the Strigoi are rising. In 1897, Bram Stoker published a novel that would transform vampire mythology forever. Dracula emerged from the pages as a sophisticated nobleman, a creature of tragic grandeur, with hypnotic eyes and aristocratic bearing. He moved through London styling white with calculated grace, seduced his victims with supernatural charm, and died with a certain operatic dignity. The book became a cultural phenomenon, spawning countless adaptations, sequels, and imitations. But in creating his immortal count, Stoker performed an act of literary alchemy that forever obscured the grotesque reality of the creature that inspired him. He took the Strigoi of Romanian folklore and transformed it into something palatable for Victorian drawing rooms. Something that could be romanticized, eroticized, and ultimately defanged of its true horror. The real Strigoi bears almost no resemblance to Stoker's creation. Where Dracula is pale and elegant, the Strigoi is bloated and ruddy. Where Dracula maintains his aristocratic composure, the Strigoi is a mindless engine of hunger. Where Dracula sleeps in a coffin, lined with his native soil, the Strigoi claws its way through the earth of its grave, dirt packed under broken fingernails, shroud torn and filthy. The authentic Romanian vampire does not seduce. It does not philosophize about immortality or play cat and mouse games with vampire hunters. It feeds with the single-minded desperation of a corpse that should be at rest, but has been denied that peace. Imagine exhuming a body that has been buried for weeks or months. You expect decay. You expect the natural process of returning to the earth. Instead, you find a corpse that appears almost alive. The skin is not pale and withered, but flushed with unnatural color, as if blood still circulates beneath the surface. The body has not collapsed inward, but appears swollen, bloated, as though it has been feeding. Most disturbing of all, there is fresh blood at the corners of the mouth, staining the burial shroud, pooling in the coffin. The hair and nails have grown. The eyes, which should be sunken and empty, seem to hold a dim awareness. This is what villagers found when they opened suspected Strigoi graves. Not the elegant count in his evening wear, but a revolting parody of life clinging to a rotting corpse. The The physical appearance of the Strigoi reflects a deep understanding of actual post-mortem processes that early modern villagers could not scientifically explain. Bodies do bloat with decomposition gases. Blood can pool and seep from orifices. Hair and nails appear to grow as the skin recedes. In the absence of modern forensic knowledge, these natural phenomena became evidence of supernatural predation. The Strigoi was not a metaphor. It was an attempted explanation for why some bodies did not decay as expected, why death seemed to be a process rather than an event, why the boundary between living and dead appeared permeable under certain circumstances. But the horror of the Strigoi extends beyond mere appearance. The creature's behavior is equally removed from Dracula's calculated hunts. The Strigoi does not travel to distant cities seeking new victims. It haunts the living it knew in life. It returns to its own home, to the bedrooms of family members, to the livestock it once tended. The violation is intimate and specific. You are not attacked by a mysterious stranger, but by your dead father, your deceased sister, your buried child. The face pressed against your window in the night is one you recognize. The hands that reach for you are ones that once held you with love. This transforms the vampire from an external threat into a corruption of the most sacred bonds. Death should bring grief and eventual healing. The Strigoi transforms death into an ongoing assault by someone you thought you had laid to rest. Consider the psychological weight of this belief system. In vampire fiction, the monster is always someone else, a foreign count, a distant threat, an outsider who can be identified and destroyed without personal cost. The Strigoi tradition offers no such comfort. Anyone can become Strigoi. Your beloved grandmother, if she dies improperly. Your infant child, if it perishes unbaptized. Your respected neighbor, if they committed a secret sin. The village elder, the local priest, anyone. This creates a state of perpetual suspicion and anxiety that no amount of garlic or holy water can fully alleviate. The enemy is not out there. The enemy is potentially everyone you know, transformed by death into something that wears a familiar face while harboring only hunger. Stoker sanitized all of this. He removed the intimate horror and replaced it with gothic atmosphere. He removed the bloated corpse and replaced it with an attractive nobleman. He removed the desperate animal feeding and replaced it with seduction and symbolic sexuality. He transformed a folk tradition rooted in genuine fear and desperate protective rituals into entertainment. This is not to diminish Dracula's literary achievement. It is a masterpiece of its genre. But it is crucial to understand what was lost in that transformation. The Strigoi represents raw, unfiltered confrontation with mortality, decay, and the terrifying possibility that our dead do not rest peacefully. Dracula represents that same fear, made safe, made beautiful, made consumable for audiences who want to feel the thrill of danger without its authentic weight. The distance between Dracula and the Strigoi is the distance between fantasy and folklore. One is designed to entertain, the other was designed to survive. The rituals, protections, and destruction methods associated with Strigoi were not narrative devices. They were practical instructions for communities that believed they faced genuine supernatural predation. When a Romanian village exhumed a suspected Strigoi and drove a stake through its heart, they were not performing theatre. They were defending themselves against what they understood as an existential threat. The screams of the corpse when the stake pierced it were not special effects. They were reported as historical fact by witnesses who swore oaths before religious authorities. This is the authentic vampire. Not a tragic figure cursed with immortality, but a corrupted corpse that should have remained buried. Not a seducer, but a predator. not an aristocrat, but a peasant who clawed free of their grave, and now haunts the living with an appetite that can never be satisfied. As we continue our journey into Strigoi mythology, hold this distinction clearly in your mind. We are not exploring fiction. We are exploring the belief system that made fiction possible, the raw material that Stoker refined into something bearable, the nightmare that inspired the dream. Not all Strigoi are corpses risen from the grave. Some walk among the living, indistinguishable during daylight hours from ordinary villagers. They tend their gardens, attend church services, participate in community gatherings. But when night falls and the village sleeps, these individuals undergo a transformation that is invisible to the naked eye, yet devastating in its effects. These are the Strigoi View, the living vampires, practitioners of a dark art that allows them to drain life force, while their physical bodies remain safely in bed. They are witches in the truest, most primal sense of the word, not practitioners of herbal magic or folk healing, but energy predators who feed on the vitality of their neighbours while maintaining a mask of normalcy. The Strigoi View operates through astral projection, though Romanian folklore would never use such modern terminology. While their physical body sleeps, their spirit detaches and roams the night in search of victims. This spirit form is invisible, intangible, capable of passing through walls and closed doors with ease. It seeks out sleeping households and attaches itself to the living, drawing away their life essence in a slow, insidious process that leaves no physical marks but produces unmistakable symptoms. Victims wake exhausted despite a full night of sleep. They grow pale and weak over weeks or months. Their appetite fades. Their vitality drains away like water through cupped hands. Doctors find no disease. Priests find no obvious curse. Yet the decline continues until the victim either dies or the Strigoi View is identified and stopped. The crucial difference between Strigoi View and Strigoi mort lies in their conscious intent and their state of being. The living vampire chooses this parasitic existence. They learn the techniques, often from other practitioners or through forbidden texts, and actively engage in the draining process. The risen corpse operates on pure instinct. Driven by hunger it cannot articulate or control. The Strigoi View maintains their humanity, their memories, their social relationships. They are your neighbour who always seems healthy while their family members sicken. They are the widow whose livestock thrives while surrounding farms fail. They are the individual who lives to an improbable age while those around them die young. The community's misfortune becomes their prosperity, and the exchange is anything but coincidental. Identifying a Strigoi View presents unique challenges. Unlike the risen corpse, which can be confirmed through exhumation, the living vampire leaves no obvious evidence. Suspicion typically falls on individuals who fit certain patterns, those who live alone, especially women past childbearing age, those who possess knowledge of herbs and folk medicine, blurring the line between healer and witch, those who maintain unusual sleeping patterns, appearing tired during the day but restless at night, those around whom misfortune seems to cluster with statistical improbability. The accusation of being Strigoi View was deadly serious, often leading to exile, execution, or forced confession under torture. The mere whisper of suspicion could destroy a life as thoroughly as any supernatural predation. The mechanism of the Strigoi View's feeding deserves deeper examination. Romanian folklore describes the process as stealing not just health, but prosperity itself. A Strigoi View can drain the fertility from a neighbour's fields, causing crops to wither while their own flourish. They can steal the milk from cows, leaving animals dry while their own livestock produces abundantly. They can draw away the vitality of an entire household. leaving a family plagued by illness, accident, and misfortune, while the witch thrives. This understanding of vampirism extends far beyond blood consumption. It represents a zero-sum worldview where resources, health, and luck are finite quantities that can be magically redistributed. If your fortune rises inexplicably while your neighbor's falls, suspicion naturally follows. Protection against Strigoi view required constant vigilance and specific countermeasures. Garlic featured prominently, but its application differed from defenses against the risen dead. Rather than placing it in corpses' mouths or on graves, it was rubbed on windowsills, hung above doorways, and consumed regularly to create an internal barrier the vampiric spirit could not penetrate. Iron was equally important. Iron nails driven into door frames, iron horseshoes placed above thresholds, iron tools positioned near beds. The protective power of iron transcends Romanian folklore, appearing in fairy traditions across Europe as a substance that supernatural entities cannot cross or tolerate. For the sleeping villager, these defenses represented the thin line between waking refreshed and waking drained. Religious intervention offered another layer of protection. Orthodox priests could bless homes, creating sacred barriers against spiritual intrusion. Holy water sprinkled around the perimeter of a property established sanctified ground that Strigoi view supposedly could not violate. Prayer itself was considered protective, particularly prayers recited before sleep. The faithful believed that maintaining a state of grace through regular confession, communion, and adherence to religious law created an internal light that vampiric spirits found repellent. This interweaving of folk magic and Christian practice characterizes much of Romanian supernatural belief, creating a hybrid system where church doctrine and ancient tradition reinforced each other. The fate of an exposed Strigoi view varied by region and era. In some communities, the accused witch could be rehabilitated through forced confession, public penance, and exile to a monastery. In others, the punishment was immediate and fatal. Fire was often employed, not just as execution, but as purification, burning away the corrupted spirit along with the physical body. Some villages forced suspected Strigoi view to consume communion bread soaked in holy water, believing this would either cure them or cause them to sicken and reveal their true. The accused rarely survived these trials, regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. Understand that the Strigoi view represents humanity's fear of the enemy within, not the obvious monster that can be identified and destroyed, but the hidden predator who shares your community, knows your vulnerabilities, and feeds on you while wearing the mask of normality. This is the vampire as betrayer, as secret parasite, as the smiling face that hides insatiable hunger. Before the corpse rises, before the grave opens, the Strigoi view is already among you, draining away life while you sleep, prospering while you decline, and never revealing the source of their power until it is far too late. The earth of a Romanian graveyard shifts in the darkness. Beneath the wooden cross and the mound of soil, something that should be still begins to move. Fingers twitch. Eyes that have been closed in death suddenly open, reflecting nothing, seeing everything. The corpse does not rest. It does not decay peacefully into the earth as intended. Instead, it begins the slow, terrible process of clawing its way upward through packed dirt and stones, driven by a hunger that death has amplified rather than ended. This is the Strigoi mort, the risen dead, the nightmare that haunted Romanian villages for centuries and continues to whisper through the folklore of the Carpathian region. This is the vampire in its most primal and horrifying form. The physical appearance of the Strigoi mort contradicts every expectation of what a corpse should be. Instead of the pale, withered body that decomposition produces, The risen vampire appears bloated and ruddy, as if it has been feeding well. The skin takes on an unnatural reddish or purplish hue, swollen with the blood it has consumed. The face is not gaunt, but full, sometimes grotesquely so, with lips pulled back to reveal teeth stained dark with dried blood. The eyes, rather than being sunken and hollow, may appear disturbingly alert or filled with a dim, predatory awareness. Hair and nails seem to have grown since burial, though this is actually the result of skin retraction. The overall effect is not of elegant undeath, but of corruption, of a body that refuses to follow the natural order and instead exists in a revolting parody of life. The clothing of the Strigoi mort tells its own story of violation. The burial shroud is torn and filthy, shredded by the creature's struggle through the earth. Dirt packs under broken fingernails and clings to hair and skin. There is no dignity here, no Gothic elegance. The risen corpse looks exactly like what it is, something that has forced its way out of a grave through desperate animalistic effort. When villagers exhumed suspected Strigoi and found bodies in this state, the evidence seemed irrefutable. The corpse had clearly been active. It had clearly been feeding. The conclusion appeared inescapable. The dead had risen, and they were preying on the living. The behavior of the Strigoi mort operates on pure instinct and overwhelming hunger. Unlike the Strigoi view, which retains human intelligence and cunning, the risen corpse is driven entirely by its need to feed. It does not plan or strategize. It simply hunts, returning to familiar places and familiar people. The creature gravitates toward its former home, toward family members, toward the livestock it tended in life. This creates a horror that is deeply personal and intimate. The thing scratching at your window is not a stranger, but your dead father. The figure standing in your doorway at midnight is your deceased wife. The face you recognize is one that should be at peace in the grave, not animated by supernatural hunger and seeking entry to your home. The feeding pattern of the Strigoi mort extends beyond simple blood consumption. While the creature does drink blood, leaving characteristic marks on the necks or wrists of victims, it also drains what Romanian folklore describes as life force or vital energy. Victims experience progressive weakness, pallor, and exhaustion, even when the blood loss seems insufficient to cause such symptoms. Livestock targeted by Strigoi are found dead or dying with no obvious cause, their bodies unmarked except for small puncture wounds that hardly seem adequate to explain their demise. This understanding of vampiric feeding suggests that blood is merely the visible component of a deeper predation, a draining of the essential spark that animates living beings. The range and habits of the Strigoi mort follow specific patterns that communities learn to recognize. The creature typically rises from its grave at night, particularly during the hours between midnight and dawn. It must return to its resting place before sunrise, as daylight holds power over it, in ways that Romanian folklore describes, but does not fully explain. The risen vampire tends to hunt within a limited geographic area, focusing on its former village or the surrounding countryside. It does not travel great distances or seek unfamiliar victims. This territorial limitation made tracking and identifying specific Strigoi possible, as patterns of death and illness could be mapped and traced back to particular graves. Physical evidence of Strigoi mort activity accumulated in ways that reinforce belief in their existence. Victims displayed consistent symptoms: progressive anemia, exhaustion, nightmares of being pressed or suffocated, and often the sensation of a weight on the chest during sleep. Animals behaved strangely near certain graves, refusing to graze or showing signs of extreme agitation. The earth around suspected Strigoi graves sometimes appeared disturbed, showing signs of movement from below. Most compelling of all were the exhumations themselves, which revealed bodies in states that seemed to defy natural decomposition. The corpse appeared too fresh, too well preserved, too obviously altered from its burial state. To pre-modern observers lacking knowledge of variable decomposition rates and post-mortem processes, these findings constituted proof of supernatural activity. The transformation into Strigoi mort was understood to be irreversible without intervention. Once risen, the creature would continue to feed indefinitely, growing stronger and more active over time. Some accounts suggest that elder Strigoi, those that had fed for years, developed enhanced abilities, greater strength, increased cunning, and more sophisticated hunting techniques. The longer a Strigoi remained active, the more devastating its impact on the community. Entire families could be wiped out, livestock populations decimated, villages abandoned as residents fled the persistent predation of an undead neighbor who refused to stay buried. The Strigoi mort represents humanity's deepest fear about death itself, that it is not an ending, but a transformation into something hostile. The corpse that should nourish the earth instead rises to consume the living. The body that should be at rest instead becomes a predator. The face that should be remembered with love instead becomes a source of terror. This is not metaphorical death or symbolic transformation. In the worldview that created the Strigoi mort mythology, this was practical reality. A danger as tangible as wolves or plague. A threat requiring specific brutal countermeasures. The risen dead were not entertainment or cautionary tales. They were monsters that demanded destruction, and Romanian folklore developed an elaborate arsenal of methods to ensure that destruction was complete and permanent. In Romanian villages, the moment of birth was fraught with more than the usual anxieties about survival and health. Midwives and family members watched for specific signs that would mark the newborn as cursed, as predisposed to become Strigoi after death, or even during life. These were not superstitions casually held, but deeply embedded beliefs that shaped how certain children were treated throughout their entire existence. To be born with certain characteristics was to be marked from the first breath as potentially dangerous, as someone who might one day rise from the grave or drain the life from their neighbors. The weight of this suspicion was crushing, transforming what should have been celebrated as new life into a source of fear and watchful dread. The most ominous sign was being born with a caul, the thin membrane that sometimes covers an infant's head and face during delivery. In many cultures, the caul is considered lucky, a sign of psychic ability or protection from drowning. Romanian folklore viewed it with profound suspicion. A child born with a caul was believed to be marked for supernatural destiny, possessing an inherent connection to the world beyond death. This connection could manifest as the ability to see spirits, to predict deaths, or, most dangerously, to become Strigoi viu during life, or Strigoi mort after death. The caul itself was sometimes preserved, kept hidden away, or destroyed in specific rituals designed to sever the child's connection to the other world. Families faced an impossible choice: acknowledge the sign and live with perpetual suspicion, or hide the truth and hope the curse would not manifest. Being born with teeth presented an equally dire omen. Natal teeth, which appear in approximately 1 in every 2,000 to 3,000 births, mark the infant as fundamentally unnatural. The logic was straightforward and chilling. Teeth are for feeding, and an infant born already equipped to bite was seen as prematurely hungry, possessing an appetite that exceeded normal human needs. Romanian folklore interpreted this as evidence of vampiric existing from birth, a predisposition to feed on others that would only intensify over time. Children born with teeth faced immediate suspicion and often underwent protective rituals, meant to bind or neutralize their supposed dark. The teeth might be filed down or even extracted, causing suffering justified by the belief that it prevented greater harm in the future. The presence of a tail or tailbone protrusion at birth constituted another unmistakable mark of the damned. This vestigial extension, medically known as a caudal appendage, occurs rarely, but was interpreted through the lens of folklore as evidence of demonic or bestial. The tail marked the child as not fully human, as partaking of animal essence, in ways that made them susceptible to becoming strigoi. The association with shape-shifting abilities was immediate and obvious. If the child possessed animal characteristics from birth, they were naturally predisposed to transform into wolves, bats, or other creatures associated with vampiric activity. Surgical removal of such tails was sometimes attempted, though success was uncertain, and the stigma remained regardless of physical alteration. Birth order carried its own supernatural weight in Romanian vampire folklore. The seventh child of the same gender in an unbroken sequence was considered inherently cursed. 7 held mystical significance across numerous traditions, representing completion, perfection, or, in darker contexts, transgression against natural limits. A family that produced 7 sons or 7 daughters in succession had, according to folklore, exceeded some invisible boundary of acceptable reproduction. The 7th child became a living violation of cosmic order, marked for transformation into strigoi. This belief created devastating social consequences as families struggled with whether to celebrate or fear the birth of a 7th same-gender child. Some accounts suggest that such children were abandoned or killed to prevent the curse from taking hold, though documentation of such practices is fragmentary and controversial. Physical characteristics beyond these dramatic signs could also mark a child as potentially dangerous. Red hair combined with blue eyes created a particularly suspicious combination in regions where such colouring was uncommon. Birthmarks in specific locations, particularly those resembling animal shapes or bite marks, raised alarm. Any unusual physical feature that set a child apart from the norm could be interpreted through the lens of Strigoi folklore as evidence of supernatural taint. The subjectivity of these interpretations meant that suspicion could fall on any child who appeared different, creating a system where physical variance itself became dangerous. The social consequences of bearing these marks extended far beyond childhood. Even if the marked individual lived an apparently normal life, suspicion followed them into adulthood and would intensify dramatically upon their death. When someone marked from birth died, their grave would be watched carefully. Exhumation might be ordered more readily than for unmarked individuals. The methods of destruction might be applied more brutally, with less hesitation or mercy. The marks identified at birth became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The community expected these individuals to become strigoi, treated them with suspicion throughout life, and ensured their transformation was confirmed through aggressive post-mortem investigation. Understand that these birth omens represented an attempt to predict and control supernatural danger through observable signs. In a world without modern medicine or scientific understanding of genetic variation, unusual physical characteristics demanded explanation. The Strigoi mythology provided that explanation, transforming random biological variants into a coherent system of supernatural identification. The tragedy lies not in the folklore itself, but in its application. Innocent children marked by chance, anatomy, or birth order, forced to carry the weight of community fear from their first moments of life. The marks of the damned were not chosen, but assigned, transforming victims into perpetual suspects in a supernatural threat that existed primarily in the collective imagination of their communities. These birth omens established a foundation of fear that shaped every subsequent interaction. The marked child grew into adulthood under watchful eyes, their every action scrutinized for evidence of vampiric tendency. Any misfortune that befell their neighbors could be attributed to their cursed. Any success they achieved could be interpreted as stolen through supernatural means. The marks identified at birth became prisons from which escape was nearly impossible, defining identity and destiny through the implacable logic of folklore that saw certain physical characteristics as windows into the soul's corruption. Birth omens marked some individuals from their first breath, but death itself created equally powerful pathways to becoming Strigoi. The manner of death, the rituals surrounding burial, and the spiritual state of the deceased at the moment of passing all determined whether the soul would find rest or return as something hungry and corrupted. Romanian Orthodox tradition held that death was not merely a physical event, but a spiritual transition requiring careful preparation and proper observance. Fail to complete the necessary rituals, die in a state of spiritual incompletion, or suffer certain types of violent death, and the soul remained trapped between worlds. Unable to move forward, unable to rest, it became Strigoi mort, condemned to feed on the living, until someone discovered the truth and destroyed the corrupted corpse. The unbaptized occupied a particularly precarious position in this supernatural geography. Baptism represented the foundational sacrament of Orthodox Christianity, the ritual that formally welcomed the soul into the church and provided spiritual protection. An infant who died before baptism existed in a state of terrible vulnerability, claimed by neither heaven nor hell, but suspended in a liminal space where darker forces could take hold. The unbaptized child could not enter consecrated ground, could not receive the full funeral rites, and most critically, lacked the spiritual armor that baptism provided against demonic influence. Romanian folklore held that such children were prime candidates for transformation into strigoi, their innocent souls corrupted by their exclusion from sacred protection. Parents lived in terror of infant mortality before the baptismal ceremony, understanding that their child's death in an unbaptized state might condemn them to undeath. Suicide created an even more damning pathway to becoming Strigoi. The Orthodox Church considered suicide a mortal sin, a rejection of God's gift of life, and an act of ultimate despair that severed the soul's connection to divine grace. Those who took their own lives could not be buried in consecrated ground or receive the full funeral rites. Their graves were often placed at crossroads or at the edge of cemeteries, physically separated from the faithful dead. The spiritual consequences were understood to be catastrophic. The suicide's soul, already in a state of profound spiritual crisis, became easy prey for corruption. Unable to find peace, denied the prayers and protections offered to other dead, the suicide victim rose as strigoi with disturbing frequency according to folklore accounts. The act of self-murder transformed the victim into a predator, their desperation in life becoming hunger in death. Violent death, particularly murder, created similar conditions for strigoi transformation. A person killed suddenly, without time for confession or final rites, died in a state of spiritual unpreparedness. Their soul remained attached to the physical world through the trauma of violent death, unable to complete the transition to whatever awaited beyond. The anger, fear, and confusion experienced in their final moments became the emotional fuel that powered their return as undead. Murder victims were especially prone to rising as strigoi because their deaths violated the natural order so profoundly. They had been denied their allotted span of years, torn from life through malicious intent, and their souls sought redress through supernatural means. The line between ghost-seeking vengeance and strigoi seeking sustenance often blurred in cases of violent death. Improper burial procedures posed yet another danger. Orthodox funeral rites were elaborate and specific, designed to ensure the soul's peaceful transition and the body's complete separation from the living world. The corpse had to be washed and dressed properly, positioned correctly in the coffin, and buried with coins placed on the eyes and a ceremonial cloth covering the face. Prayers had to be recited at specific intervals. The grave had to be dug to proper depth and oriented correctly. Candles had to burn for prescribed periods. Any deviation from these protocols risked leaving the dead in a state of spiritual incompletion, creating an opening for Strigoi transformation. Families who could not afford proper funerals, who buried their dead in haste during epidemics, or who made errors in the complex ritual requirements might inadvertently create the conditions for their loved ones to rise again. The concept of excommunication carried supernatural weight in this belief system. An individual who died while excommunicated from the Orthodox Church existed in a state of profound spiritual separation. The Church's protective grace no longer covered them. Their prayers went unheard. Their soul lacked the spiritual defenses that communion with the Church provided. Excommunicated individuals who died before reconciliation with the Church were believed to be extraordinarily vulnerable to becoming Strigoi, as their separation from sacred community left them exposed to dark forces that could animate their corpses and transform them into predators. The threat of excommunication carried temporal and eternal consequence that made it one of the Church's most powerful disciplinary tools. These death-related pathways to Strigoi transformation reveal a worldview where spiritual and physical realities were inseparable. The state of one's soul at death directly impacted what happened to the body afterward. Proper ritual observance was not merely ceremonial, but actively protective, creating barriers against supernatural corruption. The funeral rites, the baptismal ceremony, the regular participation in church sacraments, all these practices served dual purposes. They honored God and protected against the very real possibility of returning as something monstrous. In this framework, the Strigoi were not random afflictions, but consequences of spiritual negligence, violent circumstance, or ritual failure. Understand that these beliefs created immense pressure on families and communities. Every death required perfect execution of complex rituals. Every unbaptized infant represented a ticking supernatural time bomb. Every suicide or murder became a potential Strigoi incubation. The weight of these fears shaped how communities approached death, burial, and spiritual practice. The rituals were not empty traditions, but survival mechanisms, ways of ensuring that the dead stayed dead and the living remained safe from predation by those who should have found eternal rest, but instead found only hunger. The Strigoi does not remain bound to a single form. Unlike the static vampire of modern fiction, eternally trapped in human shape except for the occasional transformation into a bat, the Romanian undead possesses a fluidity that makes tracking and destroying them exponentially more difficult. The Strigoi mort can shift its shape at will, adopting forms that allow it to travel unseen, to infiltrate protected spaces, and to hunt with an adaptability that kept entire communities in a state of perpetual anxiety. These transformation abilities were not metaphorical or symbolic. In the worldview that created Strigoi mythology, shape-shifting was understood as literal fact, observed and documented by witnesses whose testimony was recorded and preserved as evidence of supernatural activity. The wolf form represented the most common and terrifying transformation. Romanian folklore holds a deep and complex relationship with wolves, creatures that were both apex predators and symbols of wilderness beyond human control. A Strigoi that assumed wolf form gained all the advantages of that animal: enhanced speed and strength, powerful jaws capable of tearing through flesh, acute senses that could track prey across vast distances, and the ability to move through forested terrain with supernatural silence. Villages reported encounters with wolves that behaved unusually, displaying intelligence beyond animal cunning and targeting specific households or individuals with focused intent. These were not normal wolves driven by hunger, but strigoi in animal form, using the wolf's body as a vessel for their predatory purpose. The transformation was complete and convincing, making identification nearly impossible until the creature was killed or observed in the act of changing. The bat transformation allowed for different strategic advantages. While wolves commanded ground-level territory, bats provided aerial access to upper-story windows, chimneys, and other entry points that traditional defenses might leave vulnerable. Romanian folklore describes strigoi transforming into unusually large bats, sometimes maintaining human-like features in disturbing hybrid forms. These creatures could land silently on windowsills, could squeeze through gaps that seemed impossibly small, and could navigate in complete darkness using senses that transcended normal animal perception. The bat form also provided psychological terror, as the creature's silhouette against the moon or its shadow crossing a window created instant recognition and fear. The association between bats and vampires predates Dracula by centuries in Romanian tradition. Rooted in observed reality, bats are nocturnal. Some species do feed on blood, and their alien appearance makes them natural symbols of otherness and threat. Mist or fog transformation represented the Strigoi's most ethereal and difficult to combat form. Romanian accounts describe Strigoi dissolving into vapor, becoming thin tendrils of mist that could seep under doors, flow through keyholes, or drift through window cracks too narrow for any solid form to penetrate. This transformation made physical barriers nearly useless. You could bar your door, seal your windows, and surround your home with protective symbols. But mist does not respect such boundaries. It flows wherever air can pass, reforming inside protected spaces and coalescing back into corporeal shape once entry had been achieved. The mist form also provided near-perfect camouflage in the fog-prone valleys of the Carpathian region, allowing Strigoi to move openly during times when natural mist already blanketed the landscape. Distinguishing supernatural from natural fog became impossible, forcing communities to treat all mist with suspicion during periods of known Strigoi activity. Some regional variations of Strigoi lore include additional transformation possibilities. Certain accounts describe Strigoi becoming rats or other vermin, allowing them to infiltrate homes through sewers and crawl spaces. Others mention transformation into dogs, taking advantage of the trust humans naturally extend to canines. The more powerful or ancient the Strigoi, the greater its repertoire of forms supposedly became. Elder vampires that had fed for decades might achieve transformations, denied to younger undead, including the ability to assume human form, so convincingly that they could walk among the living undetected. This possibility created paranoia that extended beyond obvious supernatural manifestations into everyday social interaction. Could your neighbor be Strigoi? Could the stranger asking for directions be a shape-shifted undead gathering information about vulnerable targets? The mechanics of transformation were understood to require concentration and energy. A Strigoi could not shift forms instantaneously while under attack or observation by someone of strong faith. The transformation process took moments during which the creature existed in a vulnerable, liminal state, neither fully one form nor the other. This created strategic opportunities for those hunting Strigoi. Catch the creature during transformation, and it might be destroyed more easily than when it had achieved stable form. The presence of holy symbols, prayers spoken with genuine faith, or weapons made from specific materials could prevent or interrupt transformation, forcing the Strigoi to remain in whatever shape it currently occupied. These shape-shifting abilities elevated the Strigoi from mere risen corpse to sophisticated predator, capable of adapting to virtually any defensive strategy. Communities could not simply lock their doors and hope for safety. They faced an enemy that could become mist, bat, or wolf as circumstances demanded. An enemy that could travel through the air, slip through the smallest opening, or stalk through forests with animal efficiency. The shape-shifting Strigoi represented a completeness of threat that made survival dependent on multi-layered defenses and constant vigilance. You could not predict which form the attack would take, which vulnerability would be exploited, or which protective measure would prove inadequate against a creature that refused to be bound by a single physical shape. Understand that these transformation abilities were not fantastic embellishments added for entertainment value. They were practical explanations for observed phenomena: the unusually aggressive wolf, the impossibly large bat, the mist that seemed to have purpose and direction. The shape-shifting Strigoi made sense of experiences that otherwise defied rational explanation, providing a framework for understanding threats that transcended normal predation and entered the realm of supernatural malevolence. The feeding habits of the Strigoi extend far beyond the simple blood consumption that defines vampires in popular culture. While the creature does indeed drink blood, leaving characteristic puncture marks on victims' necks or wrists, this physical predation represents only the most visible component of a much deeper and more insidious form of parasitism. Romanian folklore describes the Strigoi as draining life force itself, consuming the vital energy that animates living beings in ways that transcend mere physical, fluid loss. This understanding of vampiric feeding reveals a worldview where health, prosperity, and vitality were understood as tangible resources that could be stolen through supernatural means, transferred from victim to predator in exchanges that left entire households withering while the Strigoi grew stronger. Consider a family that falls under Strigoi predation. The attacks begin subtly, with one member experiencing disturbed sleep and morning exhaustion. They wake feeling as though they have not rested at all, despite spending the full night in bed. Their appetite diminishes. Their color fades to an unhealthy pallor. Medical examination reveals nothing obviously wrong, no disease that physicians of the era could identify or treat. Yet the decline continues steadily, week after week, as if something invisible is steadily draining away their strength. Then the symptoms spread to other family members. The father grows weak and listless. The children become pale and sickly. The mother develops mysterious ailments that defy diagnosis. The entire household enters a synchronized decline, all members deteriorating together in ways that suggest a common cause beyond coincidence or contagion. The effects extend beyond human victims to include livestock and agricultural prosperity. Farmers reported cows that suddenly stopped producing milk, chickens that ceased laying eggs, and horses that grew gaunt and weak despite adequate feeding. These animals showed no signs of disease or malnutrition, yet they wasted away as if something fundamental had been extracted from them. The parallel to human victims was unmistakable. Both were being drained of vitality, of the essential energy that enables thriving rather than mere survival. Romanian farmers understood these livestock failures as evidence of Strigoi activity, particularly when the afflicted animals belonged to households where human family members were also experiencing unexplained decline. Crops provided yet another vector for Strigoi parasitism. Fields that had produced abundant harvests for generations suddenly yielded withered, stunted plants. Fruit trees that once bore heavily now produced sparse, bitter fruit or failed to fruit at all. Grapevines that had reliably generated wine grapes for decades suddenly became barren. These agricultural failures occurred without obvious environmental cause. The weather patterns remained normal, the soil had not been depleted, and neighboring fields continued producing as expected. the selectivity of the blight pointed towards supernatural rather than natural causation. The Strigoi, according to folklore, could drain the fertility from the very earth, stealing prosperity from the land as easily as they stole blood from human veins. This concept of life force drainage operated on principles that modern audiences might find difficult to grasp, but made perfect sense within the worldview that created Strigoi mythology. Health, luck, prosperity, and vitality were understood as finite resources that existed in zero-sum relationships. If your fortune rose unexpectedly, someone else's must decline correspondingly. Wealth did not simply accumulate through effort alone, but could be magically transferred from one household to another. In this framework, the Strigoi functioned as supernatural parasites that accelerated and weaponized these natural transfers, using occult means to drain resources from victims and concentrate them in themselves or in the households they favored. The symptoms of life force drainage followed predictable patterns that communities learned to recognize: progressive fatigue despite adequate rest, weight loss despite normal eating habits, a general sense of malaise and weakness that physicians could not attribute to specific illness. Nightmares of being pressed down or suffocated during sleep, often accompanied by the sensation of a heavy weight on the chest. Dreams of deceased relatives or neighbors visiting during the night. These subjective experiences, combined with objective decline in health and prosperity, formed a diagnostic picture that pointed clearly towards Strigoi predation in the minds of those who held these beliefs. The mechanism of this energy theft remained mysterious even within folkloric explanations. Some accounts suggest that Strigoi consumed vitality through their gaze, drawing life force through eye contact with victims. Others describe the process as occurring during sleep, when victims were most vulnerable and unconscious, unable to resist the invisible drain. Still others emphasize the role of the Strigoi's presence itself, suggesting that merely being near the creature created a gradient of energy flow from living to undead. The specifics varied by region and informant, but the core concept remained consistent. The Strigoi fed on something deeper and more essential than blood, something that could not be replaced through rest or nourishment alone. This understanding of vampiric feeding explains why Strigoi predation proved so devastating to communities. A creature that merely drank blood would eventually be caught or would run out of victims. A creature that drained life force could devastate entire villages without ever being seen or physically manifesting. Families declined into poverty as their crops failed and livestock died. Children grew up weak and sickly, never achieving their full potential. Communities experienced cascading failures as the accumulated drain of Strigoi predation undermined every aspect of prosperity and well-being. The invisible of this predation made it nearly impossible to defend against through physical means alone. Understand that this expanded concept of vampiric feeding reflects genuine anxieties about invisible causation and the fragility of prosperity. Communities that lived close to subsistence understood that the line between thriving and starving was razor thin. Unexplained failures of health or harvest threatened survival in immediate and terrifying ways. The Strigoi provided an explanation for these failures, a supernatural cause that could be identified, confronted, and potentially destroyed. The life force draining vampire was not merely a monster, but an attempted answer to the question that haunted every pre-modern community. Why do some prosper while others decline, even when both work equally hard and live equally virtuously? Romanian villagers developed sophisticated systems for detecting Strigoi activity long before the creature could be definitively identified and destroyed. These signs accumulated gradually, building from isolated incidents into patterns that experienced community members learned to recognize as evidence of supernatural predation. The ability to read these signs meant the difference between early intervention and catastrophic loss, between protecting the living and allowing the undead to feed unchecked for months or years. Every unexplained death, every inexplicable illness, every strange occurrence during the night hours became potential evidence that required careful evaluation and collective interpretation. The community's survival depended on vigilance, on the willingness to see patterns in events that modern observers might dismiss as coincidence or natural misfortune. Unexplained deaths formed the most obvious and alarming category of evidence. When previously healthy individuals died suddenly without clear cause, suspicion immediately focused on possible Strigoi activity. When multiple deaths occurred within a single family or household in close succession, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Romanian communities understood that death came for everyone eventually, but they also recognized that certain death patterns violated natural expectations. A young adult in their prime dying overnight, a healthy child wasting away over weeks despite all efforts to restore their health, an entire family experiencing fatal illnesses within a short time span. These patterns demanded supernatural explanation, and the Strigoi provided the most compelling framework for understanding what was occurring. Livestock deaths and illnesses followed similar diagnostic patterns. Farmers discovered animals dead in their stalls with no signs of struggle or obvious injury, only small puncture wounds on the neck or underbelly. Cattle that produced abundant milk suddenly went dry despite proper feeding and care. Horses grew progressively weaker, becoming unable to work despite showing no symptoms of recognized diseases. Chickens stopped laying eggs. Sheep developed mysterious wasting conditions that spread through flocks with devastating speed. These agricultural disasters threatened survival as directly as human deaths, particularly in subsistence communities, where livestock represented the primary source of wealth, protein, and labor. When these animal deaths coincided with human illness in the same household, the evidence pointed unmistakably towards Strigoi predation. Nocturnal disturbances provided another category of warning signs that communities learned to interpret. Families reported hearing scratching at windows after midnight, as if something with claws or nails was attempting to gain entry. Unexplained knocking on doors echoed through the night. 3 distinct raps that seemed to demand response. Dogs barked frantically at empty spaces or refused to approach certain areas of yards that had previously been unremarkable. Horses whinnied in terror in their stables, straining against their tethers as if desperate to flee an invisible threat. These animal reactions carried particular weight, as folklore held that animals possessed sensory capabilities that allowed them to perceive supernatural presences invisible to human perception. Visual signs appeared with disturbing regularity around suspected Strigoi activity. Family members reported glimpsing shadowy figures standing at the edges of properties after dark, figures that vanished when approached or examined directly. Windows that had been securely latched were found open in the morning, with no explanation for how they had been unfastened. Footprints appeared in mud or snow around homes, but these prints followed impossible paths, appearing on windowsills or rooftops where no normal intruder could have walked. Most disturbing were reports of deceased family members being seen at night, their faces pressed against windows, or their forms standing at the foot of beds, watching the living with expressions that combined recognition and hunger. Physical symptoms in human victims followed predictable progressions that community healers and folk doctors learned to recognize. The afflicted person experienced vivid nightmares involving deceased relatives or neighbors. They woke exhausted despite full nights of sleep, often reporting dreams of suffocation or the sensation of a heavy weight pressing down on their chest. Their skin grew progressively paler, taking on a waxy quality that seemed to indicate blood loss, despite the absence of obvious wounds. Small puncture marks might appear on the neck, wrists, or inner arms, marks that the victim could not explain or did not remember receiving. Appetite diminished. Strength faded. A general malaise settled over the victim that no amount of rest or nourishment could dispel. The earth around certain graves provided its own category of evidence. Families or community members checking graveyards after periods of suspected Strigoi activity discovered disturbed soil on specific graves, as if something had been moving beneath the surface. Small holes appeared in burial mounds, large enough for mist or small animals to pass through. The wooden crosses marking graves sometimes tilted or fell over, despite having been firmly planted. Most alarming were reports of graves that appeared to breathe, the soil rising and falling rhythmically, as if the earth itself had developed respiration. These signs suggested that the corpse beneath had not achieved the stillness of true death, but remained active in some fashion, moving within its coffin or even attempting to emerge. Communities also monitored for patterns in the timing and targeting of suspected attacks. Strigoi typically focused their predation on specific households, often beginning with family members before expanding to neighbors and eventually affecting the broader community. The attacks intensified during certain phases of the moon or on specific holy days when the boundary between worlds was understood to be particularly thin. Geographic patterns emerged as well, with certain areas of villages experiencing concentrated activity while others remained relatively safe. These patterns allowed communities to predict where protection was most urgently needed and where the source of the predation might be located. Understand that these signs were not superstitious nonsense to the communities that observed them. They were practical diagnostic tools developed through generations of experience and careful observation. The patterns were real even if the supernatural explanation was incorrect. People did sicken and die in clusters. Animals did experience mysterious ailments. Strange sounds did echo through the night. The Strigoi mythology provided a framework for making sense of these experiences, for transforming scattered, frightening incidents into a coherent narrative that suggested specific actions and interventions. Reading the signs of Strigoi presence was not fantasy, but survival strategy in a world where death remained mysterious and medicine remained primitive. When the signs of Strigoi activity accumulated beyond reasonable doubt, when livestock deaths coincided with human illness and nocturnal disturbances escalated beyond explanation, the community faced a terrible decision. The suspected corpse had to be exhumed. The grave had to be opened. The body had to be examined in daylight, witnessed by multiple reliable observers, and evaluated according to specific criteria that would determine whether supernatural predation was actually occurring. This was not a decision made lightly or in haste. Exhumation violated powerful cultural and religious taboos about disturbing the dead. It required authorization from both civil and religious authorities. It demanded witnesses of unquestionable character whose testimony could withstand scrutiny. Most importantly, it required the courage to confront what might be found in that opened grave. Evidence that death was not the peaceful ending they hoped for, but a doorway to something far more disturbing. The exhumation process followed strict protocols developed through generations of practice. The ritual typically occurred during daylight hours, as sunlight was believed to hold power over undead creatures and provide protection to those conducting the investigation. A priest accompanied the party, prepared to offer prayers and blessings that would shield participants from spiritual harm. The village headman or other civil authority witnessed the proceedings to ensure legal propriety. Family members of the deceased were often present, though their participation was understood to be deeply traumatic regardless of what was discovered. Gravediggers opened the burial mound carefully, removing earth layer by layer while observers watched for any signs of disturbance from below. The tension during this process was extraordinary, as no one knew with certainty what awaited them when the coffin lid was finally lifted. The emotional impact of these discoveries cannot be overstated. Imagine being a family member forced to witness the exhumation of your loved one. You buried them weeks or months ago with proper ceremony and sincere grief. You hoped they had found peace in death after whatever suffering they endured in life. Now you stand at the edge of an open grave, looking down at a body that appears far too fresh, far too active, far too present. The face you remember with love now seems to regard you as something that might be hunger or recognition or both. The hands that once held yours appear poised to grasp. The mouth from which you heard words of affection now shows blood and signs of feeding. This is not closure. This is violation of the deepest kind. Confirmation that death has not brought rest, but transformation into something predatory. Documentation of exhumations exists in historical records from Romanian regions, providing evidence that these practices were not merely folklore, but actual events. Church records note exhumations performed with clerical approval. Civil authorities maintained accounts of bodies examined and, subsequently, destroyed. Witness testimony was recorded, often sworn before religious or legal officials. These documents describe findings that align closely with folkloric descriptions. Uncorrupted bodies, blood at the mouth, altered positions within coffins. Modern forensic can explain many of these observations through natural decomposition processes that vary based on soil conditions, coffin construction, and other factors. But for observers lacking such knowledge, the evidence appeared irrefutable. The dead had risen, and they were feeding on the living. Understand that exhumation represented a moment of terrible clarity for Romanian communities. The grave was opened, the evidence was examined, and the community had to confront the possibility that their folklore was literally true. That the dead could rise, that vampires were real, that their neighbor, their family member, their friend had become something monstrous that required destruction. The psychological weight of this realization, whether the supernatural explanation was objectively correct or not, shaped communities in profound ways. It reinforced belief systems, justified brutal practices, and created a worldview where death was never truly final until the body had been destroyed beyond any possibility of return. The choice of ash wood was deliberate and significant, rooted in properties that Romanian folklore attributed to this specific material. Ash trees held sacred status across numerous European traditions, associated with protection, purification, and the power to bind supernatural entities. The wood was believed to possess inherent qualities that made it effective against undead corruption, as if the living essence of the ash tree could overwhelm and neutralize the unnatural animation of the strigoi. Regional variations existed, with some areas preferring hawthorn or other sacred woods, but ash remained the most consistently recommended material. The stake had to be freshly cut, sharpened to a fine point, and blessed by a priest before use. These preparations transformed a simple piece of wood into a weapon capable of permanent destruction. The scream deserves deeper examination, as it represents one of the most disturbing elements of strigoi destruction folklore. Witnesses described it as a sound of pure anguish and rage, unmistakably human, yet carrying qualities that no living human voice could produce. The scream echoed across the graveyard and into the surrounding village, ensuring that everyone knew the deed was being performed. Some accounts describe the corpse's eyes opening at the moment of staking, fixing on the person wielding the stake with an expression of hatred and recognition. Others report the body convulsing or attempting to rise, even as the stake was being driven home. These details, whether literal accounts or folkloric embellishment, served to reinforce the danger of the task and the necessity of completing it without hesitation or mercy. The psychological burden of performing staking fell heavily on those designated for the task. This was not abstract violence against a distant enemy, but intimate destruction of someone who might have been a neighbor, friend, or family member in life. The person wielding the stake looked down at a face they recognized, positioned the weapon over a heart that had once beaten with human emotion, and struck with lethal intent. The fact that the target was already dead provided only limited emotional protection. The act still felt like murder, like violation, like crossing a boundary that should never be crossed. Those who performed stakings often required spiritual counseling afterward, confession to cleanse them of the psychological taint of having destroyed even an undead human form. The ashwood stake represents humanity's attempt to create a weapon effective against something that transcends normal mortality. Wood from a sacred tree, blessed by religious authority, driven with righteous purpose into the heart of corruption. The stake was simultaneously a physical tool and a spiritual weapon, its effectiveness depending as much on the faith and resolve of the wielder as on its material properties. In the worldview that created this tradition, the stake worked, not simply because it damaged tissue, but because it carried sacred power capable of overwhelming supernatural evil. The wood itself became a conduit for divine force, transforming a simple agricultural implement into an instrument of exorcism and purification. Understand that the ashwood stake was never meant to be elegant or merciful. It was a tool of desperate necessity employed by communities that believed they faced genuine existential threat from the undead. The brutality of the method reflects the perceived severity of the danger. When your children are dying, your livestock failing, and your community declining under invisible assault, mercy becomes a luxury you cannot afford. The stake was not cruelty, but survival. The difference between living in perpetual fear and reclaiming safety from supernatural predation. The tools used for dismemberment carried their own significance. Iron implements were strongly preferred, as iron held protective and binding properties across numerous folkloric traditions. An iron axe or iron knife could not only sever flesh, but also symbolically bind any supernatural forces attempting to resist destruction. The sharpness of the blade mattered less than the purity of the metal and the righteousness of the wielder's intent. Some traditions held that tools used for dismembering strigoi should be ritually purified afterward and never used for mundane purposes again, as they had been tainted by contact with undead corruption. Other traditions required that such tools be buried with the destroyed corpse or thrown into running water to ensure they carried away any lingering evil. Documented cases of strigoi dismemberment exist in historical records, though they are often described in clinical language that obscures the emotional and spiritual dimensions of the acts. Church archives note permissions granted for extraordinary measures in case of suspected vampire activity. Civil authorities recorded expenditures for additional grave materials and compensation for those who performed the dismemberment. Witness testimonies describe the procedures in detail, often emphasizing the necessity of the actions given the perceived threat to community survival. These documents provide evidence that dismemberment was not merely folklore, but practiced reality, performed by ordinary people who believed they were engaged in legitimate defense against supernatural predation. Understand that decapitation and dismemberment represent the extreme end of strigoi destruction practices, employed when all other measures had failed or when the perceived danger justified maximum intervention. These were not acts of sadism, but of desperation, performed by communities that believed they faced threats requiring responses beyond normal bounds of propriety. The brutality of the methods reflects the absoluteness of the fear, and the determination to ensure that once destroyed, the Strigoi would remain destroyed, unable to return, unable to feed, unable to threaten the living ever again. Among all protective substances employed against Strigoi predation, garlic holds the most prominent and enduring place in Romanian folklore. This humble bulb, cultivated in gardens throughout the Carpathian region, was understood to possess properties that made it fundamentally incompatible with undead existence. Garlic was not merely unpleasant to vampires or mildly repellent. It was understood as actively toxic to them, capable of creating barriers they could not cross, of purifying spaces they had corrupted, and of protecting individuals from their predation. The ubiquity of garlic in Romanian anti-vampire practices reflects both its availability to peasant communities and the depth of belief in its supernatural efficacy. Every household maintains supplies of garlic, not just for cooking, but for survival, understanding that this simple plant might represent the difference between safety and becoming a Strigoi's next victim. The applications of garlic against Strigoi were numerous and specific, refined through generations of practice into a comprehensive defensive system. Fresh garlic cloves were rubbed on windowsills and door frames, creating anointed barriers at every point of potential entry. The strong pungent oils left by this rubbing were believed to burn or repel vampiric entities attempting to pass through these openings. Windows and doors represented particularly vulnerable points where the boundary between inside and outside could be breached, and garlic sanctified these thresholds against supernatural intrusion. The rubbing had to be renewed regularly, as the oils would fade over time and lose their protective potency. During periods of known or suspected Strigoi activity, families might rub garlic on these surfaces nightly, creating fresh barriers before each dangerous darkness. Garlic braids hung above doorways, and windows provided more permanent protection, their presence creating continuous fields of repellent force that Strigoi could not overcome. These braids were constructed with care, often woven with prayers or blessings spoken over each added bulb. The garlic had to be fresh when the braid was made, harvested at specific times according to lunar cycles or religious calendars that enhanced its protective properties. Once hung, the braids remained in place for months or even years, their desiccating bulbs still retaining enough essential character to maintain the protective barrier. The visual presence of garlic braids also served social functions, signaling to neighbors the household took supernatural threats seriously and had taken appropriate protective measures. The most direct and intimate application of garlic involved placing cloves in the mouths of corpses during burial preparations. This practice served dual purposes. It prevented the deceased from becoming Strigoi, and it ensured that if they did rise, they would be incapacitated by the garlic's presence. The cloves were typically whole, pushed between the lips or teeth, so they would remain in place as the body was positioned in the coffin. Some traditions called for garlic to be placed in other orifices as well, sealing every potential exit point through which a vampiric spirit might emerge. This intimate violation of the corpse was understood as an act of love and protection, ensuring the deceased would rest peacefully rather than rising to prey upon those they had loved in life. Family members who performed this garlic placement did so with tears and prayers, acknowledging the indignity while accepting its necessity. Living individuals wore garlic as personal protection, creating mobile barriers that moved with them through dangerous spaces. Necklaces of garlic cloves were common, worn under clothing where they would rest against the skin and pulse points that Strigoi targeted. The warmth of the body would activate the garlic's oils, creating an aura of protection that extended several inches from the wearer's body. Some traditions held that garlic should be chewed before sleep, making the blood itself repellent to vampiric feeding. Others specified that garlic should be rubbed on the neck, wrists, and other vulnerable areas, anointing the body's entry points with protective substances. The smell of garlic that permeated households and individuals in Romanian villages was not merely culinary, but defensive, a constant reminder and active barrier against supernatural threat. The consumption of garlic played roles beyond creating repellent blood. Regular dietary inclusion of garlic was believed to strengthen the life force and vitality that Strigoi sought to drain, making individuals less attractive targets and more resistant to energy, vampirism. Garlic's known effects on physical health, including immune system support and circulatory benefits, aligned with folkloric beliefs about its strengthening properties. Communities that consumed garlic regularly reported fewer instances of mysterious wasting illnesses and unexplained deaths, though whether this reflected supernatural protection or improved physical health is impossible to determine definitively. The correlation between garlic consumption and reduced vampire activity was strong enough to reinforce belief in its protective properties. The theology and philosophy underlying garlic's power against Strigoi varied across different explanatory frameworks. Some traditions emphasized garlic's purity, its ability to drive away corruption through inherent cleanliness. Others focused on its potency, the strength of its essence overwhelming the weakness of undead existence. Christian interpretations sometimes linked garlic to divine creation, arguing that its protective properties reflected God's provision of natural defenses against supernatural evil. Pre-Christian perspectives might emphasize garlic's connection to earth and growth, life forces fundamentally opposed to the death and stagnation that Strigoi represented. Regardless of the specific theological framework, the practical application remained consistent. Garlic worked, and its use was mandatory for anyone seeking protection. The limitations of garlic protection were also understood and acknowledged. Garlic could not destroy a Strigoi that had already risen, only prevent entry or feeding. A vampire that gained access to a home despite garlic barriers, perhaps through invitation or by finding an unprotected entry point, could not be expelled by garlic alone. The protection was preventative rather than curative, effective at maintaining boundaries, but insufficient for confronting active threats. This understanding meant that garlic was always part of a layered defense system, combined with other protections and backed by the possibility of more aggressive interventions if prevention failed. Understand that garlic's prominence in Strigoi folklore reflects practical wisdom as much as supernatural belief. This was a substance available to even the poorest families, easily cultivated and stored, requiring no special expertise to apply. Its pungent qualities made its presence obvious, providing psychological comfort, along with supposed supernatural protection. Whether garlic actually repelled vampires, or simply provided communities with a sense of agency and control in the face of inexplicable deaths, its ubiquitous use shaped Romanian culture profoundly. The association between garlic and vampire defense has endured so completely that it has become inseparable from vampire mythology worldwide, a testament to the power and persistence of Romanian folkloric tradition. Beyond the ashwood stake, the severed head, and the protective garlic, Romanian communities employed additional weapons in their arsenal against Strigoi predation. Fire, iron, and holy water formed a trinity of purifying and binding forces that could destroy undead corruption, sanctify contaminated spaces, and create barriers that supernatural entities could not overcome. These three elements operated according to different principles, each targeting specific aspects of vampiric existence. Fire consumed and purified through transformation, reducing corrupted flesh to harmless ash, iron-bound and nullified supernatural power through its association with earth and human craft. Holy water, sanctified and expelled through divine authority, carrying the blessing of God into spaces where evil had taken root. Together, these forces created a comprehensive defensive and offensive system that addressed every dimension of the Strigoi threat. Fire represented the ultimate purification, the transformation of corruption back into elemental purity. When staking and decapitation proved insufficient, or when communities wanted absolute certainty that a Strigoi could never return, they turned to cremation. The exhumed corpse was placed on a pyre constructed specifically for this purpose, built from wood that had been blessed and positioned in a location where the fire would not spread to surrounding structures or forests. The body was typically still staked or had already been dismembered, with all parts gathered together to ensure complete destruction. As the flames consumed the corpse, witnesses watched for specific signs that the Strigoi was truly being destroyed. The body might convulse or appear to struggle against the fire. Dark smoke might rise with an unusually foul odor, or strange sounds might emerge from the burning flesh. These phenomena were interpreted as the final resistance of the undead spirit before being expelled and destroyed by the purifying flames. The ashes resulting from cremation required careful handling according to strict protocols. These were not ordinary ashes, but the physical remains of supernatural corruption, and folklore held that they retained dangerous properties if not properly disposed of. Some traditions called for the ashes to be scattered in running water, with the current carrying away any residual malevolence and preventing the particles from reassembling. Others specified that ashes should be buried at a crossroads, where the intersection of paths would confuse any lingering spirit and prevent it from finding its way back to haunt the living. Still other practices demanded that ashes be mixed with holy water and then buried in sanctified ground, combining multiple layers of purification and containment. The specific disposal method varied by region, but the underlying principle remained constant. The ashes could not simply be left to blow away or be scattered carelessly, as they represented the last physical connection to the destroyed Strigoi. Iron held power over Strigoi through principles distinct from fire's purification. This metal, extracted from earth through human labor and transformed through craft into tools and weapons, represented the intersection of natural and human realms in ways that supernatural entities found fundamentally hostile. Iron nails driven through a corpse's joints, particularly at the knees, elbows, and shoulders, were believed to pin the body in place and prevent any attempt at rising or movement. These nails did not simply pierce flesh, but symbolically bound the Strigoi to the earth, creating anchors that supernatural force could not overcome. The number of nails varied, but 7 was common, that mystically significant number appearing again in protective contexts. Each nail was blessed before being driven, and the act was accompanied by specific prayers that reinforced the binding. Iron bars, or grids, placed over graves or coffins, created physical and supernatural barriers simultaneously. The weight of the iron prevented the corpse from physically pushing up through the soil, while its metaphysical properties supposedly blocked spiritual emergence as well. Mai Kom Simon, Chakamitzmarites constructed elaborate iron cages that surrounded the entire coffin, creating complete containment systems. Others drove long iron stakes vertically through the grave at multiple points, creating a barrier forest that would impale any rising corpse that attempted to emerge. These iron installations remained in place permanently, visible markers that warned the living of what lay beneath and reminded the dead that their graves were prisons from which escape was impossible. Holy water functioned as the spiritual weapon in this trinity, carrying divine authority against supernatural evil. Orthodox priests blessed water through elaborate ceremonies that invoked God's power and transformed ordinary water into a sanctified substance, capable of burning undead flesh and expelling demonic influence. This blessed water was sprinkled on graves suspected of harboring Strigoi, creating consecrated barriers around burial sites. It was used to purify homes where vampiric activity had occurred. The priest, moving through rooms and sprinkling holy water in corners and on thresholds while reciting prayers of cleansing. Individuals seeking protection could be blessed with holy water, the priest marking their foreheads with the sign of the cross using the sanctified liquid. The application of holy water to suspected Strigoi corpses during exhumation served both diagnostic and destructive purposes. If the corpse truly harbored undead corruption, the holy water would cause visible reactions. The flesh might steam or smoke. Unusual sounds might emerge, or the body might convulse as if attempting to escape the burning liquid. These reactions confirmed the supernatural of the corpse and justified proceeding with more aggressive destruction methods. Even if no dramatic reaction occurred, the holy water sanctified the remains and created spiritual barriers that would help prevent any future rising. The liquid was liberally poured into the coffin, soaking the burial shroud and pooling around the body to ensure complete coverage. The combination of fire, iron, and holy water created a comprehensive destruction system that addressed physical, metaphysical, and spiritual dimensions of Strigoi existence. Fire destroyed the physical form. Iron bound the supernatural essence. Holy water expelled the spiritual corruption. Used together, these three forces ensured that even the most powerful Strigoi could be permanently eliminated. Communities understood that individual methods might fail against particularly strong vampires. But the combination of all three forces was considered absolutely effective. No Strigoi had ever been reported to survive cremation performed with proper ritual, iron binding, and holy water purification. This comprehensive approach represented the ultimate weapon, the final solution when all else failed, or when the threat was severe enough to justify maximum intervention. Understand that these destruction methods were not chosen arbitrarily, but reflected deep theological and philosophical understandings of corruption and purification. Fire, iron, and holy water each carried centuries of symbolic weight, their use against Strigoi drawing on traditions that extended far beyond Romanian borders and deep into human history. The fact that these same elements appear in folklore traditions worldwide suggests they tap into universal human intuitions about purity, protection, and the power to transform or destroy evil. Not every undead threat in Romanian folklore takes the form of the blood-drinking, corpse-animated Strigoi. The tradition recognizes another category of supernatural entity that exists in the liminal space between ghost and vampire, between pure spirit and reanimated flesh. These are the moroi, troubled souls whose restlessness stems not from inherent evil or supernatural corruption, but from unfinished business, unresolved attachments, or deaths that violated natural order. The moroi share certain characteristics with Strigoi, particularly their nocturnal activity and their ability to drain life force, but they operate from fundamentally different motivations and manifest through different mechanisms. Understanding the distinction between Strigoi and moroi reveals the sophistication of Romanian supernatural taxonomy, a system that recognized multiple categories of undeath and prescribed different responses based on precise identification. The moroi exist primarily as spiritual entities rather than physical revenants. While the Strigoi mort involves actual corpse reanimation, the moroi typically remain in their graves while their spirits roam. This spiritual makes them less physically dangerous than Strigoi, but potentially more persistent and difficult to identify. A moroi does not leave bite marks or cause obvious physical trauma. Instead, it drains vitality through proximity and attachment, weakening victims through spiritual rather than physical contact. Family members targeted by moroi report dreams of the deceased, feelings of presence in empty rooms, and a gradual decline in energy and health that physicians cannot attribute to specific disease. The moroi haunts rather than hunts, its predation emerging from need and attachment rather than hunger and malice. The circumstances that create moroi differ significantly from those that produce strigoi. While strigoi often result from improper burial, unbaptized death, or inherent evil, moroi typically arise from emotional or circumstantial factors that prevent the soul from achieving rest. A person who died with important tasks left incomplete might become moroi, their spirit unable to transition until those obligations are fulfilled. Someone who experienced sudden, unexpected death, without time to prepare spiritually or say goodbye to loved ones, might linger as moroi. Individuals who harbored intense attachments to specific places, objects, or people could find their spirits bound to the physical world by those connections. The moroi represents the soul that cannot let go, trapped by unfinished earthly concerns in ways that drain both the spirit itself and those it remains attached to. The symptoms of moroi predation manifest differently than strigoi attacks. Victims experience progressive exhaustion and melancholy rather than dramatic physical decline. They report vivid dreams of the deceased that feel more like visitations than normal dreaming. A sense of oppressive presence fills rooms associated with the moroi, creating atmospheres of sadness or unease that make spaces uncomfortable to occupy. Objects move or appear in unexpected locations, particularly items that held significance for the deceased during life. Candles extinguish suddenly without drafts. Doors open or close without visible cause. These poltergeist phenomena represent the moroi's attempts to communicate or complete unfinished business, their spiritual energy manifesting in ways that affect the physical world without requiring physical form. The relationship between the moroi and its victims often carries elements of love or duty rather than pure predation. A mother who died before seeing her children grown might linger as moroi, her spirit unable to release its maternal attachment. A husband who left debts unpaid or promises unfulfilled might return as moroi until those obligations are resolved. A landowner who died without properly transferring property might haunt as moroi until inheritance issues are settled. These spirits do not necessarily intend harm, but their continued presence and the energy required to maintain connection to the physical world inevitably drains those they remain attached to. The moroi is tragedy compounded, the dead unable to rest, and the living unable to properly grieve and move forward. Resolving moroi hauntings require different approaches than destroying strigoi. Violence and physical destruction were typically ineffective against primarily spiritual entities. Instead, communities focused on addressing the unfinished business that kept the spirit bound. If moroi haunted because of unfulfilled promises, those promises had to be kept by surviving family members. If property disputes prevented rest, those disputes required resolution. If the deceased lacked proper funeral rites due to sudden death, those rites had to be performed retroactively with as much completeness as possible. Orthodox priests could conduct special services designed to release troubled spirits, combining prayers for the dead with specific invocations that addressed the moroi's particular attachments or concerns. Some moroi hauntings proved resistant to simple resolution, particularly when the unfinished business was impossible to complete, or when the spiritual attachment ran too deep to sever through normal means. In these cases, more aggressive spiritual interventions became necessary. The grave might be blessed with elaborate ceremony, essentially performing a second, more thorough funeral that addressed whatever deficiencies existed in the first. Exorcism rituals could be performed at the graveside, calling upon divine authority to release the spirit and command it to cease its earthly wandering. In extreme cases, the grave might be opened and the corpse examined to ensure it showed proper signs of peaceful death and decay, with remedial measures taken if evidence suggested the spirit remained bound to the physical form. The theological understanding of moroi reflects Orthodox Christian beliefs about death, judgment, and the soul's journey after physical death. The moroi exists in a state of spiritual suspension, having left the body but failed to complete the transition to whatever awaited beyond. This incomplete state is understood as spiritually dangerous for the entity itself, as well as for the living. The moroi suffers in its liminal existence, trapped between worlds and unable to achieve the peace that should follow death. Helping the moroi to finally rest is thus an act of mercy, as much as self-protection, releasing a suffering soul from its prison while simultaneously protecting the living from the draining effects of its continued presence. Understand that the moroi tradition reveals Romanian folklore's capacity for nuance and psychological insight. Not every supernatural threat stems from evil. Not every haunting requires violent destruction. The moroi acknowledges that grief, attachment, and unfinished business create their own forms of undeath, that love and duty can bind souls as effectively as corruption or malice. This more empathetic understanding of certain hauntings provided communities with frameworks for addressing supernatural activity that didn't fit the Strigoi pattern, recognizing that sometimes the dead linger not because they are monsters, but because they are troubled, and that healing rather than destruction represents the appropriate response. In 1897, an Irish theatre manager named Bram Stoker published a novel that would forever transform how the Western world understood vampires. Dracula emerged from years of research, correspondence, and creative synthesis, drawing on multiple folkloric traditions but finding its deepest roots in the Romanian Strigoi mythology we have been exploring. Stoker never visited Romania or Transylvania. He never witnessed a Strigoi exhumation or spoke directly with villagers who lived in fear of the undead. Yet through secondary sources, scholarly accounts, and his own remarkable imagination, he accessed the authentic terror of Romanian vampire folklore and translated it into something the Victorian reading public could consume. The transformation he performed was both preservation and betrayal, capturing essential elements of Strigoi tradition while sanitizing away the aspects that made the original folklore so viscerally disturbing. Stoker's research process began in the British Museum reading room, where he studied accounts of Eastern European folklore, travel narratives about the Carpathian region, and historical texts about Wallachian princes. His working notes, preserved and studied by scholars, reveal a methodical researcher who collected details about vampire traditions from multiple cultures before focusing specifically on Romanian and Transylvanian material. He encountered the work of Emily Gerard, a Scottish writer whose essays about Transylvanian superstitions provided detailed accounts of local vampire beliefs. Gerard's descriptions of Strigoi, of protective rituals involving garlic and holy objects, of the signs that marked potential vampires from birth, all found their way into Stoker's novel in adapted forms. The authenticity of Dracula's folkloric elements stems directly from these scholarly sources, even as Stoker transformed them for literary purposes. The Hungarian scholar Armin Vambary played a crucial role in Stoker's education about Eastern European vampire traditions. Vambary, a professor at the University of Budapest and an expert on Central Asian and Eastern European cultures, met Stoker in London and shared stories about the superstitions and legends of the Carpathian region. While the exact content of their conversations remains uncertain, Vambary appears in Dracula itself as a character, the former teacher who provides Van Helsing with knowledge about the Count's true. This metatextual inclusion suggests the depth of Vanbury's influence on Stoker's understanding of vampire folklore. Through Vanbury, Stoker gained access to perspectives from someone who actually knew the region and its traditions, lending authenticity to elements that Stoker himself could only imagine. The historical figure who became Dracula, Vlad III of Wallachia, was known as Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, due to his preferred execution method. Vlad ruled Wallachia during the 15th century, defending the region against Ottoman expansion through tactics of extraordinary brutality. His reputation for impaling thousands of enemies on wooden stakes, for dining among forests of dying victims, for psychological warfare that terrorized invaders, made him a legendary figure of calculated cruelty. But Vlad himself was not associated with vampire legends during his lifetime, or in the immediate centuries after his death. He was remembered as a harsh but effective ruler, a defender of Christendom against Muslim invasion, and a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds. Stoker merged this historical figure with Transylvanian vampire folklore, creating a composite character that had no precedent in actual Romanian tradition. The geographical confusion in Dracula, placing the vampire's castle in Transylvania rather than Wallachia, where the historical Vlad ruled, reflects both Stoker's limited access to accurate information and his literary priorities. Transylvania, with its German name meaning land beyond the forest, sounded more exotic and mysterious to English ears than Wallachia. The Borgo Pass, where Stoker located Dracula's castle, offered dramatic mountain scenery that enhanced the Gothic atmosphere. The actual connection between Transylvanian vampire folklore and Wallachian history was tenuous at best, but Stoker's synthesis created a fictional geography that has since become more famous than the authentic traditions it drew from. Modern tourists visit Romania seeking Dracula's castle, a structure that never existed, in a region the historical Vlad never ruled, searching for a vampire that bears little resemblance to the actual Strigoi of Romanian folklore. What Stoker preserved from authentic Strigoi tradition deserves recognition alongside what he changed. The novel retains the importance of garlic as protection, the need for a stake through the heart, the vampire's inability to enter uninvited, and the creature's shape-shifting abilities. The concept of the undead feeding on the living, of death being reversible through supernatural means, of specific rituals being necessary to ensure permanent destruction, all these core elements come directly from Romanian folklore. Even the rule about vampires being unable to cross running water without assistance appears in traditional Strigoi beliefs. Stoker's research was thorough enough that readers familiar with authentic vampire folklore would recognize genuine elements among the Gothic embellishments. But what Stoker removed or transformed proved equally significant. He eliminated the bloated, corrupted appearance of actual Strigoi in favor of an aristocratic figure who could move through society. He removed the intimate horror of family members rising to prey on their own households, replacing it with a foreign threat invading England from abroad. He sanitized the brutal destruction methods, making staking and beheading seem almost noble rather than desperate and violent. Most significantly, he removed the context that made Strigoi folklore functional for the communities that believed in it. Romanian vampire traditions were survival strategies, practical responses to real fears about death and disease. Stoker's Dracula was entertainment, Gothic horror designed to thrill rather than protect. The novel's success ensured that Stoker's sanitized, romanticized vampire would become the template for virtually all subsequent vampire fiction. The Strigoi, that grotesque risen corpse of Romanian graveyards, disappeared beneath layers of Gothic elegance and tragic immortality. Count Dracula became the vampire, his characteristics defining the genre so completely that authentic folklore was forgotten or dismissed as crude precursor to the refined literary version. This transformation represents both cultural transmission and cultural erasure, preservation and distortion occurring simultaneously. Through Stoker, the world learned about vampires but forgot about Strigoi, gained a compelling fiction but lost connection to the desperate visceral reality of the folklore that inspired it. The rational mind assumes that vampire beliefs belong exclusively to the past, that modern education and scientific understanding have swept away such superstitions like cobwebs before a broom. This assumption proves profoundly incorrect when examining rural Romania in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Strigoi beliefs persist, not as quaint folklore preserved for tourists, but as living tradition that continues to shape behavior, influence decisions, and occasionally erupt into actions that shock the modern world. These contemporary manifestations reveal the enduring power of folkloric belief systems and the limits of rationalist assumptions about how quickly or completely traditional worldviews disappear under the pressure of modernity. The Strigoi walks still, not just in memory, but in the fears and responses of communities that maintain connections to traditions their ancestors developed centuries ago. Documented cases of Strigoi-related activities in modern Romania provide stark evidence of belief's persistence. In 2004, the village of Maritinu de Sus in southern Romania witnessed events that made international headlines. Family members exhumed the corpse of Petre Toma, a deceased relative, 6 weeks after his burial. They found the body in a state they interpreted as evidence of vampiric activity, uncorrupted flesh, ruddy colouring, and what they believed was fresh blood. Following traditional protocols, they removed the heart, burned it, mixed the ashes with water, and drank the mixture as a form of protection and cure. The family acted not from malice or insanity, but from genuine belief that Toma had become Strigoi and was causing illness among surviving relatives. When authorities discovered what had occurred, the family members faced criminal charges, creating a collision between traditional belief and modern law. The 2004 case was not isolated or unique. In 2003, another exhumation and heartburning occurred in the village of Craiova. Similar incidents have been reported from various rural regions throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, though many likely go unreported due to families' awareness that such actions violate modern legal codes. These cases share common patterns. They occur in isolated rural communities with limited access to modern medical care. They follow deaths that produced unexplained illnesses among survivors, and they adhere closely to traditional Strigoi destruction protocols passed down through generations. The practitioners are not ignorant or uneducated by their community standards, but rather are individuals who maintain traditional belief systems alongside whatever modern knowledge they possess. The persistence of Strigoi beliefs reflects multiple intersecting factors that resist simple explanations. Rural isolation plays a role, as communities distant from urban centres maintain stronger connections to traditional knowledge systems. Limited access to modern healthcare creates conditions where mysterious illnesses demand explanation, and folklore provides frameworks that modern medicine cannot always offer. Economic hardship and social stress create environments where supernatural explanations for misfortune find ready acceptance. The breakdown of traditional social structures under communism and its aftermath left spiritual vacuums that Orthodox Christianity and folk belief filled in complex combinations. These factors create conditions where Strigoi beliefs remain functionally relevant rather than merely nostalgic remnants of the past. The Romanian Orthodox Church finds itself in a complex position regarding these persistent beliefs. Official church doctrine does not support vampire mythology or endorse exhumation and corpse mutilation. Yet many rural priests understand that their parishioners hold these beliefs deeply, and that dismissing them entirely would alienate communities the church seeks to serve. Some clergy perform blessing ceremonies designed to prevent or resolve suspected Strigoi activity, providing ritual responses that acknowledge community fears while avoiding the most extreme traditional practices. This accommodation represents pragmatic pastoral care, meeting people where they are spiritually, while attempting to guide them toward church-sanctioned practices. The tension between official doctrine and pastoral reality creates ongoing negotiations about how to address supernatural beliefs that predate Christianity, but remain intertwined with orthodox practice. Modern Romanian intellectuals and folklorists approach persistent Strigoi beliefs with mixed feelings. Some view them as embarrassing remnants of backwardness that damage Romania's international reputation and hinder modernization efforts. Others recognize them as authentic cultural heritage, deserving documentation and understanding, even if not endorsement. Academic study of contemporary vampire beliefs has intensified following high-profile cases, with researchers investigating how traditional beliefs adapt to modern contexts and why they maintain power despite contradicting scientific worldviews. This scholarly attention sometimes creates its own tensions, as communities being studied resent outsiders, treating their genuine spiritual concerns as mere subjects of anthropological curiosity. The legal response to modern Strigoi-related activities creates difficult questions about religious freedom, cultural rights, and protection of the dead. Romanian law clearly prohibits grave desecration and corpse mutilation, making traditional Strigoi destruction methods illegal. Yet, prosecuting individuals who act from sincere religious or cultural beliefs raises concerns about imposing majoritarian secular values on minority traditional communities. Courts must balance respect for cultural diversity against protection of fundamental norms about treatment of human remains. These cases rarely result in severe punishment, with most defendants receiving suspended sentences or probations, suggesting judicial recognition of the complex cultural factors underlying the actions. The younger generation in rural Romania exhibits mixed relationship with Strigoi traditions. Some maintain beliefs learned from parents and grandparents, particularly those who remain in villages and participate in agricultural lifestyles where traditional knowledge systems retain relevance. Others migrate to cities, acquire modern education, and consciously reject supernatural beliefs they view as incompatible with contemporary life. Yet even among the skeptical, many retain residual unease about graves, death rituals, and nocturnal activities, suggesting that folkloric conditioning operates at levels deeper than conscious belief. The tension between traditional and modern worldviews plays out within families, with older and younger generations sometimes holding radically different positions on whether Strigoi represent real threats or mere superstition. Understand that persistent Strigoi beliefs in modern Romania reveal fundamental truths about how folklore functions and why it endures. These traditions are not random superstitions, but integrated systems that provide meaning, explanation, and response protocols for experiences that remain genuinely mysterious and frightening. Death has not become less mysterious because we understand biology better. Grief and loss have not become easier because we reject supernatural frameworks. The Strigoi persists because the human needs it addresses remain unmet by purely rational scientific worldviews. Whether the vampire is real becomes less important than understanding why the belief in it remains necessary for communities that maintain traditional relationships with death, burial, and the boundary between living and dead. We have journeyed through the shadowed valleys of Romanian vampire folklore, from the birth omens that marked children as potential Strigoi, to the brutal destruction methods communities employed to ensure their dead stayed buried. We have witnessed the transformation of authentic folklore into literary fiction, watched traditional beliefs persist into the modern era, and explored the complex relationship between the living and the dead that defines the Strigoi tradition. Now, as our exploration draws to its conclusion, we must ask the fundamental question that has haunted us since we first crossed the threshold into this dark territory. Why does the Strigoi endure? What makes this particular manifestation of vampire mythology so powerful that it has survived centuries of social change, religious transformation, scientific advancement, and cultural evolution to remain relevant and terrifying in the 21st century? The answer lies in what the Strigoi represents at its most essential level. This is not merely a monster or a supernatural threat. The Strigoi embodies humanity's deepest, most primal fears about death itself and what comes after. Every culture develops mythologies to help process the reality of mortality, but the Strigoi tradition confronts that reality with unflinching brutality. Death is not peaceful transition or spiritual release. Death is potential corruption, possible transformation into something that preys upon those you loved in life. The grave is not sanctuary or final rest. The grave is a temporary prison from which the dead might emerge if the proper rituals are not observed with perfect precision. This understanding of death as inherently dangerous, as a state requiring constant vigilance and active intervention to prevent catastrophe, reflects anxieties that remain fundamentally human, regardless of technological advancement or scientific knowledge. The violation of the grave stands as one of humanity's most universal taboos, appearing across virtually every culture and historical period. We bury our dead with ceremony and respect, marking their resting places with monuments that declare they should remain undisturbed. The Strigoi mythology inverts this fundamental expectation, suggesting that sometimes the grave must be violated, that the dead must be exhumed and destroyed to protect the living. This inversion creates profound psychological tension. The acts required to destroy Strigoi, staking corpses through the heart, severing heads, burning bodies, all constitute desecration of the worst kind. Yet the mythology frames these acts not as violations, but as necessary defenses, transforming desecration into sacred duty. This paradox reveals the extreme of the threat the Strigoi represents, a danger so severe that it justifies breaking the most fundamental taboos of civilized behavior. The intimacy of Strigoi predation distinguishes it from other vampire traditions and amplifies its psychological impact. This is not a foreign threat invading from distant lands, not a stranger whose otherness makes them easy to fear and destroy. The Strigoi is your neighbor, your family member, your friend transformed by death into something that specifically targets you because of your prior relationship. The face at your window is one you recognize. The creature draining your life force is someone you mourned. This intimate horror makes the Strigoi far more psychologically devastating than any anonymous monster could be. It transforms grief into terror, love into vulnerability, and memory into threat. The Strigoi forces confrontation with the possibility that those we love most become our greatest dangers after death, that the bonds we cherish in life become chains that drag us toward destruction. The physicality of the Strigoi, its embodied grotesqueness, speaks to fears about bodily corruption and decay that remain viscerally powerful regardless of intellectual understanding. We know rationally that decomposition is a natural process, that bodies return to Earth through mechanisms we can explain scientifically. But knowing this does not eliminate the instinctive revulsion we feel toward corpses, toward the physical reality of death and rot. The Strigoi takes this natural revulsion and amplifies it, presenting death not as peaceful dissolution, but as active corruption. The bloated body, the blood-stained mouth, the ruddy skin that should be pale. All these details assault our expectations about what dead bodies should look like. The strigoi is death refusing to follow the rules, insisting on continued presence and activity when it should be still and decaying. This violation of natural order creates horror at a level deeper than conscious thought. The strigoi tradition also reflects profound anxieties about causation and explanation that remain relevant in any era. Why do some prosper while others suffer? Why do children die while the elderly linger? Why does illness strike seemingly at random? Modern medicine provides better answers than folklore could offer, but medicine cannot answer every question or prevent every tragedy. Gaps in understanding remain, and in those gaps, explanatory frameworks like the strigoi tradition find purchase. The vampire provides agency where randomness is intolerable. It transforms inexplicable loss into comprehensible predation. It offers a target for grief and rage that might otherwise have no outlet. Whether the explanation is objectively correct matters less than its psychological utility, its ability to make suffering meaningful rather than merely random. The endurance of strigoi beliefs, even in attenuated form, suggests that folklore serves functions beyond simple explanation of natural phenomena. These traditions bind communities through shared narratives and collective responses to threat. They preserve cultural identity and historical memory. They provide frameworks for processing experiences that resist rational categorization. The fact that educated, modern individuals in urban Romania still feel unease about vampires, still avoid certain behaviors associated with strigoi prevention, indicates that folklore operates at levels of consciousness that education and rationality cannot fully erase. We carry our ancestral fears in ways we barely acknowledge, responding to stimuli that our conscious minds dismiss as superstition. As we conclude our journey into the realm of the strigoi, understand that we have been exploring more than mere folklore or literary inspiration. We have been examining how humans process their deepest fears, how communities develop defense mechanisms against threats both real and imagined, how tradition and modernity negotiate coexistence, and how the dead continue to shape the living long after burial. The strigoi walks still, not as physical threat, but as psychological archetype, as embodiment of eternal human anxieties about death, corruption, and the terrible possibility that love becomes predation and memory becomes haunting. If this exploration into authentic vampire folklore has fascinated you, if you want to continue discovering the real traditions that inspired modern horror, subscribe to Echoes of the Old World. We delve into the genuine folklore that shaped human fear across cultures and centuries, the myths that were never meant to entertain, but to warn, to protect, to help communities survive in a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural remain genuinely uncertain. The strigoi is just one shadow among many. Join us as we illuminate the darkness and discover what walks within it.